I won't clap just yet. Let's see how. I think we got. Do we have a halfway? How's that? Oh no, it wants to be dim. Have we? No. It doesn't like. Are you happy in the gloom? Will you sleep comfortably? Because it's much better, I think, that you see the slides and you don't need to see me or anything else. Good. And that video camera's sitting there happily, and I'll try not to think about that. Started with this slide. Well, first of all, I think I started with this slide because of the very thing David said, that Leicester is this fantastic mix of all periods. And I like the cathedral spire with the bus station and the ring road and all the Victorian bits in between. So we think it dates from about 1976, so that seemed perhaps a bit later, but not very much. But then this always raises that other problem I have in talking about Leicester. Are you all from Leicester? No. Good. This is where I have to apologise from coming from. Nottingham! But I've got to know and really admire Leicester, teaching here occasionally at the university in tandem with Historic England over the last 2 or 3 years and leading walks here. So I have to put the prejudice to one side. And of course we all know that Nottingham is a much more upstart young city by comparison, being merely Saxon. So, there's no Romans at all. When I think of Leicester, I think very much of your fantastic Queen Anne's buildings and your arts and crafts and the work of Ernest Jimson and so forth, which is something that stands Leicester out as being of at least national, if not international, importance. And I thought, where better really than to start if in talking about modern architecture in Leicester and Leicestershire, then perhaps with Charles Voysey's last buildings, which are in the county out at Loughton Hills. This is the lodge at Loughton, and 1920, built for William Taylor, the chap who put the dimples into golf balls, after he discovered that old golf balls travel much further than new ones, and worked out the science behind this, hence the dimples of golf balls. And his laboratory was here, and in 1935 he added this house to Voysey's design at the end of the drive. And you can see that the arts and crafts of the earlier lodge is becoming much more simplified, the horizontals much bolder, the windows much longer and broader. And really, let's have a quick look at interwar architecture in the city and think where that post-war architecture comes from. Now, all public buildings in most British towns in the 1920s almost universally follow this stripped-down neo-Georgian theme where the classical column or pilaster is just perfectly suited. That's good. To having sets of firemen, doors for fire engines in between, quite what the Greeks would have made of it, never mind. But there's the wyvern at the top. Here is Leicester's preeminent fire station with the housing around it for the firemen to live in. 1925 to 7, A&T Sorday, and it's the model, the new types of fire station all over Britain. I think we forget just how important this building is. but it's really standing today as a sort of archetypal of that Neo-Georgian architecture. And you can see round the city people like Symington, Prince and Pike here, with St Barnabas Library, and I could also show you Southfields or Pot Pie Library, 1937, 1939 respectively. But taking that classical proportions and simplifying them down still further, probably inspired by this building, which is Gunnar Asplund's Stockholm Town Hall of 1925 to 28. And it's a massive, massive building by comparison with the two little libraries in Leicester. But this was known. It was one of those sort of benchmark flagship buildings of the interwar years, on that cusp between classicism, particularly in those fantastic proportions, and Greek mouldings, and then the starkness of that drum, which is the main reading room. And I'm sure that Prince and Pike would have known that. And here's the other one, of course, 1939. Now, the attention in the interwar period was always on building lots of more houses, more suburbs, relieving the overcrowding and some clearance in the town. And you start with sort of the Saffron Lane estate, perhaps gives a flavour of what was continued after the war. This was the council's first major effort to build large-scale public housing after Henry Hallam, a Labour councillor, took over the housing committee for the hung council at Leicester. And residents include both Joe Orton and Sue Townsend. So I suppose one reacting against suburbia, one very much celebrating it. And you see the changing architecture. This is not a local architect, Robert Bullivant of Harry Whedon and Partners, Birmingham firm responsible for Odeon cinemas all over the country. And again, picking up a lot of international sources, particularly from northern Germany. I think this one still very classical in those that fluting over the windows. But here, looking something to German expressionism, and particularly those examples that you see in other towns with the tall towers. This is 1937, and here's the inside for Good Measure, now a wedding venue. But that Art Deco quality, something that is a modern architecture, but thinking more, still keeping some features of decoration, thinking about turning corners, thinking about architecture that you would drive by on a big road, like the A6 with Bluntridge. This is Symington, Prince and Pike again, 1935. So at the same time that they could do broadly traditional libraries, they were producing these more decorative commercial buildings. And I think the flavour of the interwar period, if we have to contrast it with what comes after 1945, is the sense, never quite lost in the 20s and 30s, of the style for the job. So that those public buildings, fire stations and libraries, quite serious, dignified, but you could be somewhat lighter. You could allude to Mediterranean pantiles with those green pantiles there, the shell features, something that was a little bit more light-hearted for a furniture store, which I think this was as originally built. And the police station behind in Charles Street, could you see it just lurking at the back of that building? We go down the block, here's the old police station of 1933, G. Noel Hill and A.T. Guzman, the city architects of that period before Noel Hill goes off to Manchester and really embraces modernism up there. This is stripping classicism down to its absolute core. And of course, Charles Street gave architects this unique possibilities for new building by widening the whole road, taking out the west side, one side of the street completely to widen it. You have this beautiful ensemble of interwar buildings. And so City Hall, 1938, a competition won by an outside architect, not local, but Barnish and Silcock of Liverpool, showing what could be done. The competition was 1931, but it took until the late 30s for the economy to revive, for the political moment to be right, for the local authority to spend some money on itself. And it was the rates department. It was and I put this view on, coming this way, because this end was the electricity showrooms where they did the cookery demonstrations, and there was even a little lecture theatre, and inside these murals showing the latest appliances still survive. So I'm sort of bringing you up to date into modern architecture very slowly. Let's come a little bit quicker with Lewis's by another Liverpool architect, Gerald de Courcy Fraser, Liverpool dynasty of architects, and responsible for a number of stores, of which Lewis's in Liverpool, not to be confused with John Lewis, as you all know, but I just check. And the tower, because all that survives. The Liverpool, there's my old photograph of it. So apologies in advance for some of the quality of my older slides. 1935 to 36. If we're coming right into modernism and the foretaste of what's to come after 1945, this is one of the preeminent buildings in the country. And a reminder that the modern architecture, modernism, the modern movement, whatever you like to call it, has two main sources in this country, and neither of them are British. One is that influx of emigre architects. You were talking about Konrad Smigelski earlier, coming from Poland. The other great source of architects interested in the modern movement came from our very own empire, or the dominions. So people like Wells Coates from Canada, Connell and Ward from New Zealand, and Raymond McGrath was an Australian who came to Britain to make his fortune at a time when schools of architecture in Australia were really much in thrall to the Royal Institute of British Architects in London and its competitions, and so that to fully qualify in the Commonwealth and to be able to work anywhere, they needed British qualifications and British training. And so McGrath comes over here, he gets a patron in Manny Forbes at Cambridge University, who introduces him in turn to Sir Charles Keane, for whom he builds Kingstone. And it's showing McGrath as one of the great inventors in the use of curtain walling, in glass, in building. If you think people around the world were only just beginning to use glass to that extent, fronting a whole building. And the pink vitrolite panels compared with the blue, something very novel. And there's also a house which I've never seen out at ʻdɑrbi, originally called Land's End, now Carrygate, very private thing. I've written an aspect and I've never been able to see it. So this is a design from 1934-5, as drawn up for publication by the illustrator Gordon Cullen. And you can just see in this old photograph the house slightly revised as built in 1938-9. So that's your starting, how really from having a very specific architecture that's unique to Leicester in its Queen Anne and arts, and particularly its arts and crafts style. Leicester, like so many British cities in the interwar period, starts to embrace a huge variety of sources depending on the type of work, with one or two buildings of real quality, but moving slowly towards a sort of stripping down of ornament and the modern movement in style. So come the war, 8 air raids, I think only one doing really serious damage, 19th and 20th of November 1940. And it's really the opportunity that the war gives to planners, thinkers, the humanitarians wanting to make a better city, looking at the opportunity for redevelopment and improvement, and building on the frustrations of the 20s and 30s when so much had been promised to of homes for heroes that hadn't happened after the First World War. And there was a very real sense that that must not happen again, coupled with, I think, huge concerns nationally, if not particularly in Leicester, which is always so prosperous, that there could be a real chance of a return to the unemployment that had so blighted people's lives in the 20s and 30s. And so a much more proactive national and local government roles were needed, such as encouraging ex-servicemen and women to do higher education courses by offering free places at universities, which is partly how the University College of Leicester first started to expand. And one of the first and greatest problems for Leicester was the need for new homes, which is nothing really much to do with bomb damage, much more to do with a rising population, immigration to work in the munitions factories and factories in light engineering in the city, and the need to build decent homes and do away with overcrowding and the worst of the oldest housing on the north and east sides of the city. So your general result of turning your swords into ploughshares is turning your Spitfires into prefabs. And this is an aluminium prefab. There were 39,000 of these built. If anybody knows of any surviving, let me know. Winston Churchill promised 500,000 new homes under the Temporary Homes Act of 1943. And 153,653 prefabs were erected, mainly using prisoner of war labour, before it became very quickly much more economical to build ordinary houses as bricks and other materials began to become available again. But can you see these strips here and here? Yes? The prefab came shipped on in 4 sections that could be reassembled. So that is the width of a 1940s lorry. And even the kitchen and bathroom came in the unit ready assembled. Very much based on ideas from the United States, where houses were shipped out on little trucks as part of the Tennessee Valley program. And in Leicester, the flagship program is the New Parks housing estate, begun in September 1945. And these look much more conventional than the single-storey prefab. But again, it's an aluminium frame clad partly in steel, endorsed by the Iron and Steel Federation, 2 stories, known as Easy Form. And some 572 of these appeared in the city in 1946. But that very quickly superseded by these more traditional houses. And I think New Parks is really interesting because it shows the whole range of housing that was available in 1945, from the prefabricated to the brick. I mean, still traditional pitch roofs, not flat roofs, but rather broad, square-paned windows, very, very simplified, very simple, straight porches just supported on a single pole. This kind of very austere architecture appears almost out of nowhere, it seems, but it's a response to the shortages of materials. Buildings were licensed, i.e. rationed, until November 1954, so that the government could direct the limited materials into new schools, new housing, and into industry. So the pub and the church and shops and cinemas had to wait. And you see in this aerial picture, the councillors go off to Copenhagen and Stockholm, have to have a look at what particularly Stockholm had been doing during the war, where, because Sweden was neutral, building had continued, and there'd been an influx of people, I suppose refugees into Sweden, influx of people from the country to the town, and so the building of flats had continued. And these, I haven't got a pointer, so those ones there, those low ones, it's much easier to jump, isn't it? Remind me very much Gröndal, this development on the west side of Stockholm by Renius and Backstrom from 1944, becomes a model for a lot of post-war housing in this country. But nowhere else do we know that the councillors actually visited it from Leicester, and the little curved form, they're like a little series of linked semicircles of 3 or 4 story flats all joined together. Impossible to photograph because they were designed before motor cars became widely available. And so now there's car parking in every available space. But you get the basic idea, and New Parks shows it quite carefully. And the aluminium, my Spitfires into prefabs, the housing programme came to an end in 1948, but aluminium became a very useful and widely used material for the building of schools. The architect Dennis Clark Hall, who himself designed schools, explained that prefabrication was really too expensive when you've got to assemble bits from an awful lot of different places, your cladding, your bathtubs, your cupboards and so forth, into one place where the unit was so small. So for schools being bigger, it was actually much more economic to do that. And the British Aeroplane Company in 1949 developed this kind of school, which you see here at Forest Lodge, Charner Road, 1949-50, so it's one of the first examples. The very first was in Bristol. And you can always spot them by these ribs kind of triangulating and bracing the structure. Aluminium classrooms, brick for the boiler house, the headmaster's study, the dining hall, assembly hall, and so forth. And examples like this were shipped out to, I've seen them in Australia, they were shipped out to South Africa, Iraq, Europe, anywhere where the British Airplane Company could make a sale. The pub followed in 1954, and the pubs of the post-war period try and look as much like an ordinary house as possible. Of course, they're always much, much bigger, but this is very much the standard post-war pub, deliberately domestic, not trying to look like a Victorian gin palace where you could stand and swill beer and spirits all day, but somewhere quite domestic and refined, where you could take the missus and sit in the lounge, and there's a separate off sales discreetly round the back. And the shopping centre, when it was finally completed in 1958, actually won an RIBA award. It won the RIBA Bronze Medal for the East Midlands in that year. So it's a really good place still to discover and explore the architecture of that immediate post-war period of austerity, material shortages. And it's followed by more development in the Braunston estate, which had been begun in the 1930s. Here it is, building work getting back together again, underway in 1953. And Ayres Monsell, this is a picture of 1958, with grateful thanks to the Leicester Mercury website. And again, new schools featuring large windows. There'd been growing concern for kiddies' eyesight. So you get these large windows in schools, a rejection of that Victorian board school ethic where the windows were so high, like in this place, too high up so you can't be distracted to look out. That idea had gone, and instead we basically boiled or froze, didn't we, in 1950s schools. This is 1956 Scrapped Off Road. And the bringing together of all this post-war idealism, and some people say its real last stand, certainly its most famous moment, is the Festival of Britain in 1951 on London's South Bank. You can just see the shed of Waterloo Station in the background of this photograph. And it's most unusual to see a colour photograph of the festival. And this is the entranceway, the station gate with the timber arch in the middle there, the transport on the left, the steam engine looking terribly old-fashioned compared with the architecture. And probably the greatest innovation was the tubs for the plants. Are you all right? Do you want some of the water? No, there's some if you want. So, in fact, it's not a bad idea, is it? Yeah, my voice will go. I'll be coughing like you in a minute. And then on the right, the section known as the Land of Britain, that was dedicated to showing Britain as an island, the island of coal in the sea of fish idea, with all our special resources. And the Festival of Britain was very much a trade exhibition and a cultural exhibition, showing how Britain could rise again, having lost so many of its assets in winning the war and losing its empire bit by bit, but could still lead the world, as Princess Elizabeth said opening the show, in the world of ideas. And that's the sort of idealism of this period. And you can see here the Sea and Shipbuilding exhibition by Basil Spence. If I turned the camera round from where I'd been standing facing Waterloo Station to face the river, the Sea and Ships Pavilion, with this bucket statue by Richard Hughes that tipped as it filled with water, then you can position yourself, and Skylon would be just to the left of the image here, and the Dome of Discovery, more or less where this bank of people here is. And Basil Spence went on, while the exhibition was still on, Spence, who by the 1950s was really best known as an exhibition designer, won the competition for Coventry Cathedral, that most symbolic of all rebuildings after bomb damage, and the sort of symbol of Britain's Guernica, of the Phoenix rising from the ashes, with the War Requiem commissioned for its grand opening in 1962 by the Queen. And there you have the tapestry by Graham Sutherland. Now, the Bishop of Coventry also got Spence to design 3 teeny-weeny little churches in the Coventry suburb for the war damage payment for compensation for the bombing of one city centre church. This is St Oswald in Tile Hill. A little concrete frame, very simple, tapestry by Gerald Holtham, the only decoration, and even the walls are made of concrete, and the pattern of the concrete left exposed. And so the Bishop of Leicester starts to think that's an interesting little idea. And so he writes to Basil Spence saying, basically, what can you do for Leicester? And what Spence offers are the 2 new churches. Now, at Ayres Monsell, only the church hall gets built in 1958, and that poor tower that's doing better service as a radio mast is really only a fragment of what Spence intended, partly botched up and hidden behind a bit of brick, and the fittings inside are all from other sources. But at St Aidan's in New Parks, which is why I'm doing the churches now, you can see 1957-9, the whole dignity of a new church, complete with the church, this walkway, the bell frame there, no bell, and the vicarage, with a mural by William Gordon. Here's the inside. Oh, well done. Thank you. Because the back row are really struggling. So here's looking at the back, looking at the wall of the last photo, looking forward. Very, very simple steel frame, timber ceilings, brick and concrete walls, but all the pews and fittings designed by Spence and his assistants. Well, I'm going to be all right. I hope you are too. And but still a very much a conventional church plan. You know, here's the vicar up here talking to his congregation down there. Here's the mural of St Aidan by William Gordon, who was a ceramicist, a potter from York, Chesterfield. And this was his first tile picture. And you can see St Aidan semi-abstract there. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Now all the screens will speak. Can you feel anything up there? Good, good. Now I'm going to put all the churches together and get you through the post-war church story in one go. It's much easier. This is St Paul's Bow Common in East London, replacing a church that was bombed in the Blitz down in Poplar. And very near where the first V2 landed as well. And in 1958-60, it was rebuilt by Robert Maguire and Keith Murray with this square plan. It's built up as a series of square masses around a central altar. And thinking about, I suppose it's like theatre, Stephen Joseph, theatre in the round, thinking about liturgy in the round, bringing people closer to God, bringing the altar and the word closer to the congregation. Problem was, of course, if you'd got some of the congregation or a few naughty choir boys giggling behind you, unsupervised. And so when you get to its later developments, it's picked, the idea comes from Northern Europe, from the Catholic churches of Belgium and the Rhine Valley, essentially. And it developed by the Anglican Church in this country, on the whole, slightly ahead of its adoption by the Roman Catholics, except in a few odd places. And it's 1964 when the Second Vatican Council talks about bringing services into doing away with Latin, using modern languages, bringing congregations closer together again, and that in Britain it was decreed that the altar should come forward. And so St Joseph's in Uppingham Road by Thomas Wilson, 1967-8, listed a couple of years ago, shows this transformation very well. The altar's been changed again in about 2001, but here you have the church coming in an apron form, very theatrical, again, a little bit like we are in this auditorium today, so that if I were an actor or a priest, you would all be in my radius. Peter Hall at the Barbican talked about having his audience in a sight line of about 130 degrees, so he didn't have to move his eyes to get them all in. I can't quite do that with you. Father Thomas here at Uppingham Road certainly can't either, but you get the basic idea that nobody is more than 30 or 40 feet from the altar or the lectern. The font at the back, the coloured glass added in 2002 by Goddard and Gibbs. So, while we've talked about private houses about council housing and the first council estates after the war, remember that people also wanted to have a house of their own, that sales of private houses start to go up from about 1952, and particularly once building materials become generally available in 54. Harold Macmillan talked about setting the people free by taking off buildings for building materials from licensing. So this is Shackerside Road on the Wigston boundary. Wheatcroft's, big volume house builders, building here in the mid-1950s, and very substantial houses they are too. This is my ideal of a 1950s bungalow. I think from near Loughborough, by that Mount Sorrel stone there for the chimney, and the beautifully graded roof there. But the idea of living in a bungalow with that picture chimney and the slightly angled shape of the whole thing. I think the second garage is a later addition, but this is the very much, so a little nod perhaps to Frank Lloyd Wright, an American prairie living. But the ideal that my parents had was a bungalow. Never had it, of course, but the one house in Leicester that I think really embodies this ideal is an Avenue Road, by fellow Atkinson and Brenda Walker of the firm James Cubitt and Partners, designed in 1953, i.e. when licensing still controlled not only the materials but how big a private house could be. It was limited to 1,500 square feet. So Harold and Joan Goddard said, well, no hall, not going to waste space on stairs. And you can see by this night photo how there's everything, every inch of space has got a purpose. There's a tiny corridor on that right-hand side where the children's bedrooms are. But you come straight into the house and there's the kitchen, there's the living room, here, little study, bedroom, garage. There's absolutely no wasted space whatsoever. Built in 1954-5, very little altered. It's a remarkable survival. You can see the quality of the detailing, how the doors are almost at the full height of the house, the small but perfect little square fireplace with that long overmantel there. And this is a real 1950s feature, the built-in unit between the kitchen and the dining space. It's particularly beautiful, I think, on the kitchen side where you have the colour introduced. And so you could, no servants, because that's one of the three things that make private houses so different in the post-war period from what had gone before. Most people still had a daily, at least, in the 1930s, or most middle-class people. Something like 1 million servants disappeared into war work, never came back. And so that meant that post-war houses could be open plan. You didn't have to shield the kitchen and service area away from where the family were so that one could talk without the other overhearing. And bigger sheets of glass become available. Central heating becomes available, all of which aid this much open, freer planning of houses. To return to council housing, then that slum clearance programme that had been abandoned in the 1930s, really before it got going. There was legislation in 1935 that certainly in Leicester led to very few cleared sites, but in after 1954, government policy moved away from general needs housing, i.e. fulfilling housing shortages, back towards slum clearance for the poorest families. And so you get first the St Matthew's estate in the north of the city, completed by 1965, but then with two towers added in 68. As here, and Rowlett Lane, you've got the same image virtually down there. I don't know what company made these 4 identical towers across the north and east of the city. And having done that, I think they've all now gone, haven't they? But here's Goodwin and Marston houses. Here they are coming down. So you've got before and after. And then Highfields on the east side of the city, where the St. Peter's housing estate was this very, very ambitious, let's say over-ambitious scheme by the council to rebuild brewery area, slum housing with its own direct labour force, using locally employed builders. And the job was too big for them. Wimpy has to be brought in to finish the job and to do those taller blocks. What should have cost £3 million, an enormous sum for the mid-60s, cost £7 million by the time it was finished in 1973. And there you can see, on completion, glistening with newness and ambition. And it's in that delay, while the surrounding housing waiting to be cleared, cheap is so affordable that it's very attractive to families from Uganda, Asia, anywhere outside Britain to come and settle. And that, I suppose, it's like the clothing industries were attracted to Carnaby Street and King's Road because they were areas that were going to be redeveloped, and so rents were very cheap. So you get all the trendy clothing shops and boutiques of the 1960s. Same is true with Highfields and housing in Leicester. The cheapness of it made it very attractive and developing a whole new community. And Jane Jacobs, an American theorist, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, explains that you need these sort of twilight areas to encourage the next cultural surge of any cities. And I would now argue it's the cheapness and availability of 60s housing, 60s shops and shopping centres that make the next generation of entrepreneurs and home tenant residents able to come into a community and develop in turn. And it's 1976, Shelter campaigned successfully that there should be no more clearance, because then council, for all its endeavours, are not building as many new homes as they are clearing old ones, and the new rents are much higher than the old rents. And so all new housing is just creating more poverty and overcrowding somewhere else. And so the rebuilding programme comes to an end in 76. So higher education, Leicester City Council buys Scraptoff Hall as its College of Education and adds these new buildings to the designs of Bridgewater and Shepherd, all built in 1957 to 62, demolished in 2003, hence the old photos. Wonderful car. Assembly hall, library, gymnasium, residence. But here we are in Leicester University, perhaps the city's educational flagship, founded in 1919, local manufacturer Thomas Fielding Johnson buys the County Pauper Lunatic Asylum, which had been abandoned for that purpose in 1907 and been used as a hospital in the First World War, and gives the site for a university college with 9 acres, and most of the land goes for a boys' school and a girls' school over that way. But here we have the Fielding Johnson building. By 1945, I think it's 122 students in 1939. It's a reminder of how small these university colleges mainly were. Leicester and Hull, both founded in the 1920s, very small. But the post-war, they start to grow rapidly. Firstly, because of the ex-servicemen and women coming here, and then the tendency for more kids to stay on at school. And in now I think it's my next slide is the silly one. Now here's the total plan. So we're here, and then in 1945, the university gets this other parcel of land for its science building. You can see the walk down the middle there. It's not me jumping, it's hitting this that's the problem. The schools are over here, and to this old 9 acres they get another 12 or so. It's still tiny compared with Nottingham, Hull, Southampton, Exeter, who've got a whole hill to build on the edge of town. You know, Leicester's campus, by 20th century standards, and particularly post-war standards, is tiny. But it has the great attraction that it's near the city centre, and there's other open space to form a lung around it, so that it can be built up quite densely. And 1957, no, let's get the silly one out of the way. The Students' Union building. So here we have this sort of classicism of the old asylum by William Parsons, 1837, continued. And I do apologise, it's the best picture I could find on the web. It's an election poster for the Students' Union. But it gives you the idea, you see. And for how old-fashioned is that for architecture for 1958? Once it gets full university status in 1957, the building committee bring in Leslie Martin. And Leslie Martin, who'd been the architect of the Royal Festival Hall, the head chief architect of the London County Council, he'd had a nervous breakdown and become Professor of Architecture at Cambridge University. He'd done a PhD, so academics knew that he was one of them. But he was, as well as being one of the best qualified architects in the country, and so that he would understand what they wanted. And so he produces a master plan for the science area and the first buildings. With not having a proper office himself, just a handful of ex-students and associates, most of his buildings are done in partnership with younger architects, people he'd worked with at London, or he'd taught, or he admired, and he brought up sort of acolytes in his field. So following physics, the Bennett building at the back is done with a young firm called Castle and Park, later Castle Park Dean Hook. His sidekick from London County Council, who followed him to Cambridge, was Colin St John Wilson, who later went on to build the British Library, and he does the lecture theatre here. But for the engineering building, now the engineering building is not part of that original master plan, because they thought that one of those two 1920 schools could be used for the engineering building. And it's only later when they appoint a professor of engineering, Edward Parkes, that idea goes out the window, and Parkes is very specific that he wants a proper new building with these very carefully controlled laboratories and workshops with water pressure for his hydraulic testing from a 100-foot tower, that he wants 2 great lecture theatres, a bit like this. And so Martin suggests 2 other young architects who had he'd encouraged, suggested for a competition for Churchill College, Cambridge. They come 4th, I suppose, but they'd done very well in that competition. And so he recommends James Stirling and James Gowan to produce this, which I would argue is the best, most original post-war building in England, and one of the most distinctive anywhere in the world. Why do I think this? I think it's that taking of all the different elements. It's not austere. It's moving on from that simple architecture of the 1950s. It's responding to Leicester's traditions of being engineering, workshop, Northlight roof structures and workshops, the red brick and tile, very much a Leicester arts and crafts tradition, isn't it? But doing it in a much more expressionistic, perhaps, way, looking at international sources as well. And I think just the engineering of getting all those little lozenge lights. James Gowan said they were like a paperweight, and he didn't like the idea. He wanted to do something else, but he couldn't get away that was the perfect solution. And Frank Newby, the engineer, was absolutely key to the project. More or less, the story is James Stirling and James Gowan met working for a firm in London called Lyons Israel Ellis. Both were born in Glasgow. Stirling had moved as a child to Liverpool. So they very much know North British towns and engineering culture. Stirling's father was a ship's engineer. Here they are on the roof, a topping out ceremony. It's all smiles. Actually, they didn't get on at all well. So if you think, why is the tower quite so separate from the workshop? The usual story goes that the tower is Stirling and the workshop block is Gowan's, and they just happen to meet in the middle. I don't think it's quite so simple. Stirling had first tried his hand with a university competition in 1952. I put the captions on for these because it's quite a complicated story. And you can see the canting of the lecture theatres in the middle. Unplaced, as it says. But then he gets packed off to Paris to write an article for the leading architectural magazine, Architectural Review, of the houses, the Maison Joual, 2 private houses by Le Corbusier, going up to where La Défense is now, on the outskirts of Paris. And Corb had been working in India. He'd seen that Indian vernacular of brick and exposed concrete floor plates, and he repeats it on the suburbs of Paris. And Stirling is the first Briton to see this. He writes back how wonderful it is. And the Maison Joual have a much greater impact on British architecture, or what's sometimes called New Brutalism, than it does anywhere else in Europe. Here's Stirling's own take on it. At Ham Common, southwest London, Richmond, in 1955-8. These waterspouts were absolute straight rip-off of Le Corbusier, and you can see the similarity with the Maison Joual. He got stuck on the back part of the site, which is where James Gowan came in. Now, I've only had this story from Gowan, who is necessarily biased, but he's fed up after, I think, a generation of people raving about what an important figure Stirling was, who's the great promoter. Gowan, the quiet one who goes mainly into teaching, starts to get his own back at the end of the career. and starts to say, that bit was me. So the back end of this is Gowan. And there's a lot of their work at Avenham, a suburb of Preston, where they rebuild Victorian terraces in red brick, but modern with bathrooms, looking, I think, a lot at Dutch architecture, with those straight red-sided brick and terraces and not a bit of space wasted. Very much a Gowan trope, I think. And the first scheme, now, they get the job, and both the client, Edward Parkes, and James Stirling, then go off teaching in America. Now, they can confer, because one's on the East Coast and one's on the West Coast. They meet up over there. Meanwhile, Gowan can get on doing the first designs. So that's why it starts getting complicated. All we have of the first scheme is this photograph of this model showing a dirty grey lump. There's the park, and how difficult it is to get all that Parkes wanted onto that tiny narrow site. One reason why there aren't any teaching rooms, there's very few professors and tutors' officers in the engineering building. They were expected all to be in Fielding Johnson. So you've only got to get your workshops, your labs and your lecture theatres in. But even then it's a squeeze. Now you start seeing columns sticking out into the road to try and get it all in. Here's one of the few dated drawings, February 1960, and how then corners get sliced off to fit over the roadway. This is when Stirling comes back from America in March 1960 and starts refining, chipping down what Gowan's done, knocking the corners off, expressing the rake seating like you're sitting on as on the undersides of the building, and making the windows all jagged and expressionistic. Here's his source, or one of them perhaps, in Moscow, this House of Culture. It was a theatre for trade unions, and different trade unions could either use one theatre or joined up all the three balconies separately. And the scheme, the tower, gets refined really before Gowan gets the idea for the workshops looking like diamonds. They're still the problem being here that the site is so cramped, it's got to fit this way, but north is that way. So you've got to think how to turn the windows to get the north light without the whole thing overheating. And Gowan had a mature student who produces quite independently this scheme. A rather unfortunate figure. I think he dies very young, in his 30s, and is one of those people who seems to be quite influential on a number of architects in London, Howell, Killit, to name it, as well as James Gowan. And so here's the drawing starting to appear in early 1961. And as finally construction begins in 61, goes massively over budget and delayed, of course, inevitably. But I think this is it before the recent refurbishment. But I think really extremely jewel-like in the way that workshop lighting works, and contrasted with the red and the bands of glazing in the tower. The glazing on the main tower has already been altered in the 80s, originally much lighter frames than it is now, but descriptions of it leaking in the early 80s were absolutely staggering. Here's the inside. And you see how the redness goes all the way through, and the whole building works all together inside and out. The pink railings are almost the last touch. They definitely are Sterling's. And if you go to his late work in Stuttgart, or even to Tate Britain, the Claw Gallery, pink is he still uses pink for all his handrails. There's there's a very simple concrete with the putlock holes coming from, I think, Sterling teaching in New Haven at Yale University alongside Louis Kahn, who'd used concrete in exactly that same way there. There we go. And it even became a stamp. I think this shows how important universities were to post-war architecture. These were the country houses of the 1960s. This was where government funding was at its most generous. So you see Leicester alongside Exeter, Southampton and Aberystwyth there. And further buildings by Dennis Lasdun, the architect of the National Theatre, whose stamp you just saw, 1965, and Arup Associates with the Attenborough building. And this is what the library used to look like, Castle Park, Dean Hook, 1972-4, before it was the facade extended forward and reclad. And at the same time, Leslie Martin was particularly interested in resident accommodation, I think because of the sort of serial, repetitive nature of student accommodation. And he and one of his former assistants on the Royal Festival Hall, Trevor Dannett, designed College Hall for women students, now College Court, 1958-60. And then Dannett goes on to produce the Vaughan College. Now the college part closed, but the museum part is still open, 1960-62. Very much of a personal take on this rather neutral concrete and brick style. Martin, I think, very much influenced by Alvar Aalto, Finnish architect, making the idiom his own. And you can see how Martin and Dannett and this little group of architects sort of influenced university architecture. Really, here's, I think this has been demolished, Leonard Manasseh at Gilbert Murray Hall, 1966, and Dennis Lasdun again with Stamford Hall, not a well-known building at all to non-Leicester people. I think people don't know that Lasdun did so much work here, but this rather curious series of common rooms against the dining hall here, 1964. But if you go to Hull University, you will feel at home. Again, Leslie Martin producing the plan, bringing in Dannett, Wilson, Castle and Park, producing the same quality of brick and concrete architecture. And this is the halls of residence there. So, let's move on. The city centre I haven't really spoken about. I'm not going to talk about the replanning of the city centre, but the great changes of Leicester were really brought about by development of more shopping and more motor cars, and the Lee Circle car park with its own bowling alley and petrol station, 1960-61, the absolute height of bowling alley craze, 1961. Fitzroy Robinson and Partners. The council had talked about building car parks himself. Huge battles with the chief of police over parking meters before they said a car park was the way forward. And so this private development, which was then followed by the Abbey Motor Hotel, car park with hotel on top. What could be more modern swinging in 60s? Where we have the Haymarket Centre, designed from 1963, demolition work begins in 65, shops, nightclub, cinema, ice rink, hotel, none of that lot happened apart from the shop and the shops and the nightclub. Never. But then later the Haymarket Theatre was added. There we go, opening in 73, and I think set to reopen again, hopefully, in 2000 later this year. There it is in current condition. And the Phoenix, it was supposed to replace the Phoenix Theatre, which is now the Sue Townsend Theatre, again, City Architects Department. Leicester Market, very early in the use of GRP. We've talked about glass in buildings, concrete, haven't really hit steel. One of the great materials of the 60s and particularly the 70s, glass reinforced polyester that allowed translucent light into a deep dark space. And various proposals for a new civic centre, the first of them here in the park, abandoned in 1956. Then in 1960, the City Council bring in London architects, Chamberlain, Powell and Bonn, architects of the Barbican Centre and Leeds University, to produce this monster scheme. There's various permutations. This one, here's New Walk, there's the art gallery, and there's new, all singing, dancing, every council chamber, amenity department, all on one site. Some variations even included a new art gallery. I think that gives you the scale of it. Once the costs had risen, £7 million, it wasn't really going to get very far. And 1966, the national government announces the beginnings of local government reorganisation. So it wasn't going to sanction authorities to build loans to build new council house chambers until the post-1974 reorganisation. And so in the all you've got, now does this survive? I've been late trying to find it and I think it's gone. I thought it had. Albion House, all that was built. And instead, as you know, the council takes over the New Walk Centre, which was a spec-built office building that had never been occupied, for the cost, instead of 7 million, a mere 5 million, and instead now it has City Hall. Meanwhile, the county council had built Glenfield, the county office, for a modest 1.8 million in 1958 to 65 by the county architect Thomas Locke. That's my better picture. And mural by Anthony Holloway, whose work you see on a lot of schools all over Britain. Council chamber. But I think what's really impressive is the way that the county then goes on, parallel story to the city. The county council architects department, and under its director of education, Stuart Mason, is one of the leading patrons of modern architecture in the country through the late 50s to the early 1970s. So let's Loughborough University, which part of the college made up of several colleges, including Technical College School of Engineering. The Wavy building, as it's now called, is 1952 by the County Council. Shepherd Robson and Partners add the Edward Herbert building, the Students' Union, in 1963. And then once full university status is granted in 66, Arup Associates are brought in to do a master plan. The sculpture is the best bit of the teaching buildings, I think. Lynn Chadwick's The Watchers. look after this. There was a matching one in London that's been pinched. So I hope yours is nice and safe. And then the towers, the David Collett Hall, 1966 onwards. But what's really fascinating are the series of schools built in the county, which are absolutely unique and precious anywhere in the country. Because Mason was one of the first people to think about bringing art and music into schools, and also planning schools around a sort of the central library or information centre. So the first ones bring in outside architects. This is Peter Morrow, again somebody who'd worked with Leslie Martin on the Royal Festival Hall. This is Highcliffe Infant School, 1962 at Birstall. And then you see it much more clearly, this sort of centralised hall in Glenmere School at Winston by Farmer and Dark from 1964, nearly finished, so don't worry. Richmond School, this is where that information centre becomes absolutely key. It's the little building on the top there, where the kids can go up for individual lessons, views out, and there's this library and resource centre underneath, still there, partly hidden by later developments. 1970, by the County Architects Department. There's the little top-knot meeting room. And I think the most impressive of all, by Ahrens, Burton and Korolek, London-based architects at Thurmaston. This is Eastfield County Primary. I've only got old slides of this. But a whole series of semi-open plan classrooms with working spaces in between them, and thinking about sort of child-centred spaces, child activities, places to encourage the child to explore for himself or herself. So this library is the first spaces you see as you come in through the door, and then the classrooms are set out beyond it. You can tell it's an old picture because the kids are in it. You can't photograph them these days. And then moving on, there's Stuart Mason develops the idea of colleges, taking the old secondary schools and turning them into high schools, the old grammar schools into colleges for students aged 15 to 18, so the sort of young adult centres really, again strongly featuring art and music, as with the Bernard Shotland thing there, and producing, I think, 3 new buildings that are designed not just as for schools, but to be social centres for semi-rural communities and run adult education courses. Stuart Mason was very much influenced by Henry Morris, Director of Education at Cambridge, who invented the idea of the village college and brought in Walter Gropius to design Impington Village College, which was designed to provide for education sort of from age 3 to the grave. And that's what Mason was trying to do at Desford here in 1967-70 by Gollins, Melvin and Ward. Particularly Countersthorpe at College, Farmer and Dark, where the whole plan is of a wheel. Within the centre, sculpture by Philip King, Chanctonbury Wing, and then the Library Resource Centre looking onto this. And finally, Reek Valley at Syston with the library perched on top of a drama hall. So there were activities for, and a big wing out here for adult education, so that it could be used evenings, weekends as well. There's the back, the most amazing chimney. And there's the library, right in the middle of the whole thing. Now, moving on to close. Education, Leicester has carried on providing great higher education buildings, and in particular this one, the Queen's Building at De Montfort University by Alan Short of Short Ford Architects, 1989 competition win, and one of the first buildings of this scale really to think seriously about natural ventilation, natural cooling, large thermal mass, so you don't need too much heat in winter either. Hence the rather strange shapes, brickwork. Inside, it has a really strong Victorian feel, but also, I think, strong echoes of Alan Short's previously had worked for Ted Cullinan, who was fond of this kind of seating and use of brickwork as well. And even think Abbey Park campus by Bon Brown, carrying on some of those ideals, 2009. I made Leicester's most curious listed building. It's a standard type developed by the American Elliott Noyes in 1964 for mobile all over the world. In Britain, only one survives. Built 1978-9 at Red Hill, and there are hardly any left anywhere in the world, so it is a remarkable survival piece. Postmodernism, you've not had much postmodernism. Whether you count the Queen's Building at De Montfort, I don't know, but here's the Shires, 1991, absolute classic of the sort of semi-classic revival with those lights and those capitals. Mosques, a new building type for Britain at any rate, where an emphasis is really more on materials. Historic England is about to publish a book on the history of mosques in Britain, and the emphasis has been on quality materials, bringing the best quality from Dubai or the Middle East, rather than on individual architects' expression. Very different, shall we say, from star-architecture that we have in a lot of buildings today. So I'm going to end with the John Lewis, 2009, Farshid Musavi, Foreign Office Architects, and perhaps star-architecture of the extreme kind with the Curve Theatre by Raphael Vignoli. Certainly dramatic, certainly fearless like those foxes. Thank you very much indeed.